The real reason why poor people are poor. During my research on this topic, I found out that there is a culture of poverty, which means that the flawed choices and behavior of poor people made them who they are. It relates poverty to the road of success, whereby you finish school, get a job, get married, then start a family. Very few people that follow this road end up in poverty. There's also the belief that choices are restricted to the circumstances of where you live. Racism, gender discrimination, economic dislocation are some factors that shape poor people's choices. It's true that everyone doesn't have an equal opportunity in life. However, everyone is responsible for their decisions and choices, and the context to which those choices and decisions were made shouldn't be ignored. Now, let's look at the real reasons why poor people are poor. 1. Government policies. Government policies should come in question on whether they help make or they help keep people poor. They include strategies and policies that governments come up with and the funds they put in place for poverty alleviation programs. Instead of having ineffective debates day in and day out on what program to be increased by a couple of billions or reduced by the same, they need to bring out reforms on certain areas of government that are mostly harming poor people. For example, people in the US have social welfare programs that they can access for healthcare and food provisions. Not all governments in the world provide the same to their citizens. With little to no safety net, vulnerable poor families keep on backsliding into extreme poverty. Ineffective government and government policies contribute to extreme poverty, as they are unable to provide the basic and necessary infrastructure for the safety and security of their citizens, especially when in conflict. 2. Education. Numerous studies suggest that educational attainment is a significant determinant of financial success. In one instance, most poor families can't afford to send their children to school. They need them to work. Some poor families don't believe in educating girls. Yet, education can open doors to opportunities, skills, resources that will help families survive and eventually thrive. According to UNESCO, 171 million people would flee poverty if all they came out with from school is basic reading skills. More education would cut world poverty in half. But yet, some government schools are not doing enough in educating children, especially those children that are growing up in poverty. These schools, attended by children in poverty, have weak educational outcomes, as compared to those schools with affluent students. Despite the massive spending on public school by the government, this weak performance and outcome is still realized. The same poor families have little alternative to the failing government schools. Some states in the US have made it illegal to send your child to a public school outside your assigned district. The government education monotony can be broken down by efficient anti-poverty programs. Parents should have a choice of where they can send their children to receive a good education. They should be given control and shouldn't be limited to how they can escape poverty through education. Educational reforms are empirical in getting families away from poverty. 3. Housing. While government policies increase the cost of living, taxes, trade barriers, this causes stress to those families already struggling to put food on the table. Housing policy is one area we should keenly look at, especially in urban sectors. Poor people are moving from rural areas to urban cities in search of better life and jobs. In the booming economic cities, there seem to be more opportunities for poor people to get jobs. However, housing becomes a huge problem due to costs. This situation led to the development of slums in cities. A poor person's income mostly covers their rent. Land use policies and zoning increase the percentage of the cost of housing in some cities. For example, New York and San Francisco have amongst the highest zoning costs at 50% or more. These regulations not only raise the rental cost, but they also keep the poor people away from locations with better schools and job opportunities. Poor people in developing countries living in slum areas are now subjected to poor infrastructure and minimal pay that doesn't help them rise out of poverty. 4. Savings. Savings is extremely important in getting out of poverty. Reducing consumption and increasing savings is what poor people should aim for. Banking laws have made it hard for poor people to access banking systems. The asset tests for public programs don't favor the poor in terms of saving. Social Security reduces opportunities for the poor to save themselves. Current policies need to be reconfigured to encourage saving and investment. In developing countries, poor people have menial jobs with a meager income. Those in cities survive on a day-to-day earning, and very little is saved for a rainy day. The structures in place in many countries are not working to better poor people's lives. As a result, the poor keep remaining in the same situation. 5. Economic growth. Policies that are to be pursued, such as lowering taxes, and policies that encourage investments and entrepreneurship can create free markets and improve economic growth, which will increase the wealth in the society. Encouraging economic growth in a country should include poor people, and they should be participating in the growing economy. Therefore, eliminating barriers like occupational zoning, minimum wage, and occupational licensing rules would be helpful. Different professions require a license to practice in at least one state in the U.S. These professions include makeup artists, florists, funeral attendants. These can be barriers that could unlock employment and entrepreneurial opportunities for poor people with low skills, occupations, and prices. Minimum wage laws hinder low-skilled workers from getting that first job. Occupational zoning hinders a poor person from starting a small business in their home. 6. Criminal justice. It would be correct to say that bias against the poor and their over-criminalization have increased poverty rates. Furthermore, the criminal justice system is also a part of it. A family with a father in prison is more likely to increase their poverty state. In the U.S., 5 million children have an imprisoned father, and this has contributed to poverty in America. Having a history of incarceration, having a criminal record, limits one's ability to succeed in the labor market and be self-sufficient. These criminal sanctions are overwhelming financially and emotionally, and they destabilize families, marriages, and children. Most slum areas in developing countries are attributed to criminal activities. Therefore, the government doesn't spend money on security and infrastructure development in such areas. People living here are subjected to poverty because they are associated with criminal activities. In cases of conflict with violence in a country with slums, these people become the most affected. 7. Climate change. The World Bank estimates that climate change has the capacity of pushing 100 million people into poverty in the next 10 years. Natural events like flooding, drought, and massive storms severely impact communities, especially those living in poverty. That's because many poor people rely on farming activities to earn a living. Many poor families usually only have enough food to last till the next season. They have little reserves for times of poor harvests and natural tragedies. When such natural disasters strike, they leave millions of poor people without food, shelter, and they become susceptible to diseases that push them further into poverty. In such situations, recovery is very difficult. 8. Lack of infrastructure. Infrastructure development enhances economic viability. Good transport systems, water systems, telecommunication, among others, are significant in alleviating poverty. Lack of such infrastructure isolates communities in rural settings. Living in such places means you have little to no access and ability to go to school, work, and market, to sell and buy goods. It's also expensive to travel for long distances to access basic services that should be provided by the government. Living off the grid costs a lot of money, and it makes low-income families stay poor. Isolation is very limiting. Opportunities that you would have had are already limited. Hence, low-income families stay in extreme poverty due to poor infrastructure. 9. Inequality and marginalization. There are numerous kinds of inequalities, such as economic and social inequalities, that are affecting many people in the world. For example, inequalities in gender, tribal affiliations, caste system marginalization, among others. They all mean the same thing. Inequality is the unequal access to resources to keep and lift anyone from poverty. Some inequalities are obvious, while others are very subtle. The voices of certain groups might not be voiced in a community meeting, making them have no say in making important decisions. These inequalities affect people, making them lack the tools to escape poverty. It makes low-income families that are already vulnerable not able to get ahead. Inequality leaves people living in extreme poverty. 10. Conflict. Conflicts adversely affect poor people in several ways. Large-scale conflict with violence in developing countries brings societies to a stop. Conflict destroys infrastructure and causes migration, a refugee crisis, as families are forced to leave their assets and flee. In Syria, for example, 70% of the population lives in poverty due to prolonged conflict. And it's sad, because this was once a country where extreme poverty was very rare. Conflict and violence also affect women majorly. Female-headed households become very common. Since women have difficulties getting well-paying jobs and making decisions in their communities, their families become extremely vulnerable. Small-scale conflicts with violence also hugely impact struggling communities. A farmer worried about the theft of crops and destruction of property wouldn't invest in planting anymore. And women and children become sexual violence targets, since they are vulnerable. 11. Lack of livelihood and jobs. Without a way to make money, people will face poverty. It's not easy assuming that if someone wants a job, they can easily get one. In developing countries and rural areas, this isn't easy. Many traditional livelihoods depending on productive lands are affected by conflict, climate change, and overexploitation of resources, such as fish and minerals. For example, most of the DRC's population lives in rural areas, and the natural resources in these areas have already been and continue to be plundered since the colonialism era. Conflicts on land disputes have led people in these areas to leave the lands that they depend on for food and money. More than half of the DRC is living in poverty. Inconsistent work and low-paying jobs can make families live in poverty. No work at all would mean a family can't live without assistance. 12. Lack of clean water and hunger. According to the WHO, it's estimated that 2 billion people have no access to clean water at home, and 800 million people are suffering from hunger. Poverty is thought to cause hunger and prevent people from accessing clean water, but these two factors, hunger and clean water, are the main reasons why poor people are still poor. When a person doesn't get enough food, they don't get the strength and energy to work. Lack of food and clean water also leads to diseases like diarrhea that are preventable. Poor people have to travel long distances to access clinics, and they end up spending all their money in medicine. This situation is draining the already vulnerable people. When clean water is available, it's usually very far from poor and rural communities. Women and girls have to trek every day to fetch drinking water. That time they spend on water could be used for working, getting an education, and securing a job to better their lives. 13. Lack of reserves. People living in poverty don't have means and savings to weather the storms of life. When drought, conflict, illness strikes, the little saved or the assets they have is used to help alleviate their situation. For example, in Ethiopia, the cycle of droughts has caused failed harvests after harvests, leading to the widespread hunger crisis. How do these poor families cope? They pull their children out of school, sell off their assets and property, just so they can eat. This hard solution helps them survive one bad season, but what about the next one? Communities constantly facing climate extremes and prolonged conflicts make families sink deeper into poverty and prevents them from recovering. In conclusion, empowering poor people and allowing them to take control of their lives gives them a chance to lift themselves out of poverty. Working with communities to help them tackle the roots of poverty would be helpful. Teaching them how to cope with climate change, better government priorities in increasing easy access to clean water, and proper education would assist vulnerable families to escape poverty. Well, that's it for the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it and learned a thing or two. With that said, have a great day, and subscribe if you're new to the channel.